We're always in survival mode on these rocks, in this in this scattering rocks in the Caribbean. We're always in survival mode. Some of us more than others.
Welcome to Wandering Through Wisdom with me, Amani, where every conversation is a journey into learning and unlearning, rethinking and reimagining. My guest for today is Jamaican writer Roland Watson Grant. He is a recipient of the Musgrave Award for Literature, and in 2021, he was the regional winner of the Commonwealth Short Story Prize. In this episode, we speak about fiction as warning, the role and responsibility of the Caribbean storyteller in the face of the region's continued vulnerabilities. In particular, we focus on his short story, Mark Yourself Safe, which takes us inside the mind of a homeless man while Jamaica braced for Hurricane Melissa in October 2025. What does disaster look like for the most vulnerable? What does it mean to give a voice to the most marginalized? And what significance do stories carry in the wake of disaster?
I'm Roland Watson Grant. I have an alter ego that's an advertising guy. But I think in the context of this interview, I am a creative writer, Caribbean writer, and just, I think, a person who writes in this space where cultures have conversations, and to also make sure that when all is said and done, that it's written down in a way where fiction becomes a greater truth, because you're able to put so many things into fiction that is usually either it is reflection, or it is a warning, or it is a concern, or it is just the joy of being alive and being Caribbean.
There's a lot of stories from you, and there's a lot of writing out there that we could talk about. But what really drew me was your short story, Marked Safe, which I read last year. And
Yes.
I wanted you to begin by telling me, what is this story about to you, the writer?
Well, there are a number of things why I'm proud of that story. It's only 800 words. And I think first I should say that I was happy for the opportunity from Pre. I particularly enjoyed the opportunity to do something that was within the vein of Melissa and how much of a dangerous storm the hurricane was, and then to see that through the eyes of fiction and to speak to the greater truths of it. So, I'm bigging up Pre, Annie Paul, and Isis Majhal. And then I want to say that story allowed me, and as we speak, we will get more into it, allowed me to understand not just the plight of some human beings in the face of natural disasters, but also the frailties that we have as people who live on stones in the middle of the ocean and who have to rebuild each time. But it also, as a writer, spoke to me about the technical things that we have to work with, and how do you make sure that the technical aspect of writing meets the content that you want to create. I'm particularly proud of it because I think there were two circles that had a particular kind of sweet spot in the middle where I joined those two things. It doesn't happen very often. I'm happy about that. But I was really happy to be able to put that down and to speak about the plight, especially of the homeless in a natural disaster.
One of the things I'm curious about is, why did you choose to focus on this particular angle? Because when we're looking at disaster, you could talk about the before, the during, the after. So was it a question of urgency for you?
It's always been. I'll tell you, one of the statements in that story is that if you want to be seen, go on social media. If you want to disappear, go insane. In the Caribbean, I don't think, and I stand to be corrected. I've been saying this for years, and I think that maybe what I've been saying is outdated, and maybe we're doing better now. But I think in the Caribbean, and I would say in Jamaica, that we have a very laissez-faire attitude towards mental illness, both in our actions and everyday actions, in terms of how we self-care, but also in terms of how institutions handle those who are mentally challenged. And I just never, ever, even myself, I never thought about what happens to those who have no homes. During COVID, we had a prime minister who was very present every day, and he kept saying, Tanaya yard, which is the Jamaican way of saying stay home. And all the nurses were saying stay home, and there were stickers and COVID-19, this and that. And, the question arose, what about those who have no homes? What about those who have no yard to tana? But also people who literally didn't have the what I'm going to call the floor, the measurement inside their own homes to be able to stay there and be accommodated with 9 other people, 9 or 6 other people. They just don't. And so it becomes a quandary. And I don't think we think about this. I think sometimes, members of society and others, people who have been privileged, do not think about the fact that there are persons who literally live in a completely different reality than we do when it comes to the things that we take for granted. So I thought I needed to say this because I don't think a lot of people thought about it, especially in an impending storm. And I really don't think that I thought about it either.
Like you said, it's such a different perspective that those of us who might be privileged to not live that reality, we wouldn't have these considerations when preparing for a storm. So I really appreciated you giving voice to that. And one of the things I wanted to talk about is you spoke about the technical elements. What really stood out to me was this stream of consciousness style. And I wanted to know your decision making and thought process behind using this technique and embodying that specific voice. What was the intention behind that?
So I was in New Orleans at the time, and New Orleans is one of the interesting places for me. You know, is where magical realism meets everything else, and you walk down the street and it's magical and all that. And I felt like, how do I introduce a certain element of not being of this world, living in an alternate reality, but also when Isis said, "You have 1,000 words," that's really the thing. It's not the magical realism of New Orleans that did it. It was you have 800 words. You're going to have to investigate how to handle 800 words or something like that. Like, are you crazy? But I grew up in advertising. I'm the advertising guy. I know what summary is, and I know how to make 30-second short stories. So I said, well, let's see what would be the structure that would most likely be very appropriate to do something that is not just SOC, because stream of consciousness is one thing. But in short story workshops, I always say, let's look at what you have. Look at all the things you have. The inconvenience pressures you to be more creative. And out of that comes something else. So with the story, I said, well, stream of consciousness would help, but a stream of consciousness would perhaps come from a person who speaks to themselves. So this is not just stream of consciousness, but a person who speaks to themselves as two people. And so you won't get a response from the other person. You have to now use the monologue, which is something I always wanted to do. I always wanted to do that. And at once I said, I'm going to do a Commonwealth story that's purely a monologue. And then I said, in the middle of it, I said, I can't do this. Congratulations, by the way, on your listing the other day in Commonwealth.
Thank you. Thank you.
Absolutely. And I said, so we're a situation where we have a particular kind of monologue, but we have to let it sound like two people. Now, creatively, what you have is a person who speaks to themselves. So it worked out. So when I discovered that, I didn't write it at the same time when I discovered, okay, that's the structure that I want. That's the method I'm going to use. Now we have to start thinking about who would this person be? And then I said, well, it would be somebody who is mentally challenged and who is homeless. And then I started thinking about what happens to these people who have no homes, no shelter, and who really, when the shelters are packed, or persons who don't know about shelters, or what do they do? And then the story began to deepen for me, because then I had to answer these questions. And so I thought about and did research on, where do you find the greatest number of homeless people in Jamaica? And what do they do when the rain begins to fall, and so on? And I know about some of these places, and the industrial terrace is one of them, and all different things. But then you have now to go to the ending, which has to do with what eventually happens to, the character.
Okay, we'll get to the ending in a while because I'm very curious about that ending, but I want to go back to the beginning of the story. So
Right.
I was very struck by your choice of how you invited readers into the story with that line, "Shut up, Leroy." That's the first line of the story. That's how we meet our character. That's how we get a sense of what's going to be happening. I'm curious about the intention and the choice here, because you know how you begin a story is not just about how you capture your audience, but how you set the pace of what the story is going to look like.
Absolutely. There is a voicelessness. And again, and I really I keep calling Isis's name, but I have to. There are particular persons, and that's why I respect my editor as well. But I think in the past, we have had conversations, Isis and myself, about silences. And there are a number of silences that exist in our existence. And our history has been muted in many ways. And we've been told a child must be seen, but seen and not heard, and that kind of thing. And I wanted to really register, first of all, two things. Shut up, Leroy seems like a simple line. It's very curt, but it was going to now establish that this is a person speaking to himself. That's one. But two, shut up is what we're used to. Say nothing about it. You must not only disappear, you must also keep quiet, so that you are not seen. And in the case of the mentally challenged, you're also shut down and shut up because you're not supposed to appear. Move from your so, mad boy. And so that shut up was potent for me, because it said, I'm shutting you up and I'm shutting you down. And then the name Leroy was important as well, but it's a cultural nuance, but I'm going to explode it a little bit. Leroy, every second Jamaican, it is said, is called Leroy. Every second Yo, Bridget Leroy, Leroy, I'm named Leroy, Winston, and we had a little back and forth about this. Diana was also a part of the editing team who did that edition of Pre. And one of the things that we got into was a conversation about unremarkableness, about people who are just like anybody else, who are not special in any way. Every second person is called Leroy, and therefore this person is a Leroy. Nobody cares. Nobody absolutely cares about Leroy. We don't care what his past life is. We don't know what he's done. We don't care if he had a mortgage. We don't care. He's just on the streets, a mad boy, and he wears plastic and khakis, and we don't care. Or he wears the T-shirt from the church convention or the phone company. And I specifically use the church convention or this phone company because this is communication, but you're being told to shut up, and you're being told to be redeemed, but you're not. There's no redemption for Leroy at all. From his very birth, his name says, you are cookie cutter. You're no one. Shut up, Leroy. And that's how I began. And I think it hit me hard when I realized how it began. He's nobody.
It did hit me really hard when I read it, but hearing you explain that context behind it, the layers to it that I didn't notice in reading it, wow, that was very impressive. I wanted to talk about the ending a little bit.
Okay.
For me, I don't normally care for neat or tidy endings, but in this one, I felt myself very anxious to know what would become of Leroy. And I think especially because of that word length, it's a very quick pace of a story. So I'm running along with him and then I'm like, oh, wait, what now? I wanted to ask for you as a writer, how do you determine this is where the story ends? This is the point where we break from each other as writer and reader.
I think one of the issues I've always had with short stories, and I've said it since reading James Joyce when I was probably 12, James Joyce Dubliners, which is a classic. I read that before Olive Senior, and Olive Senior, I sing her praises all the time because I realized she did something else. While Dubliners kept you in suspense at the very end, Dubliners kind of leaves you in the air and makes you figure out everything about the ending. And yes, you must leave some things for readers to figure out. But I think James Joyce left you there. A girl is running, following a ship, and then, it's disappear. Okay, what happened? I didn't want that to happen. I think Olive Senior lands the plane for you in a short story. She lands it for you. You can assume what happens after that, but she has to give you some kind of tangible thing to say this happened. At the end, I decide how to make a short story end when I think that we have pull together all the things that we think might have redeemed the character. Not necessarily, it hasn't necessarily happened, his redemption hasn't happened or anything, but I pull it together now to say, now let's see how slippery the kind of fate that you want for yourself is. Let's see how slippery it is. Because you could always say he lived happily ever after. But I kind of leave it to the reader to say, listen, what you think about, I want you to think about what happened outside of the text. What happened outside of the text is a wind gust of 200 and something in Melissa. Now, having spoken about that and having spoken about Leroy's destination, do you think he survived? And I leave that rhetorical question there.
Reading the text and taking away the reality from it, it made me question, am I a pessimist? Am I an optimist? Like, what is going to happen to Leroy? And me as the reader, what future am I going to invent for Leroy? But like you said, when we speak about the reality of what happens, we realize that there's only so many options in that scenario.
I would love for Leroy to have the happiest ending ever, and for him to get the help he needs. I would love that. But we know that within the story, Leroy came about during another quiet storm, one that involved no wind. That quiet storm of COVID that just swept across and did everything and emptied the streets as we know it. And here we are again. And I think it was important at the end to say, well, yeah, is it pessimist or optimist or realist, And then it also allowed me to make a comment that sometimes when the reality comes, we kind of always in survival mode. We're always in survival mode on these rocks, and this scattering rocks in the Caribbean. We're always in survival mode. Some of us more than others. I didn't want Leroy to have a happily ever after. I wanted to leave it suspended because I need for us to think about our own fates. I wrote a story called Everybody Live Uptown Now, and it's about a tsunami swallowing half of Kingston. People don't like when you mash up the place where you're coming from, they don't like it. But the comment was being made because I do not believe that we have an action plan. I don't believe that the land that I live in has an action plan for a 15th parish. Portmore is about to become a 15th parish. Portmore is in some respects very close to sea level. I don't think we have a plan for evacuation of Portmore. So while I go in with an issue, I try to write a human story. I'm not trying to go in and go with like a tree hug and people say, okay, you're writing a brochure. This is not a brochure about environmental protection. No, I am writing a human story, but it will have some of the challenges that we have. So everybody live uptown now is about, do we really have an action plan? Or what exactly would a disaster like that look like? So when Melissa was bearing down on Jamaica, a friend of mine called me and said, out on the streets look a lot like what you wrote about. I never want to be clairvoyant. I just know that the variables are always in the air. When you put them together, equation spells disaster. And we really need to think about these things. With all the politicking and all the other things, let's really, really think about what that looks like. And to exacerbate that situation, now we have a report 2 days ago that only 1 point something % of the money that has been sent for aid to Jamaica has been spent on those who need it. So Leroy continues to be timely and he continues to make the point. We don't care. Do we care? Let me ask it as a question. Do we really care? Those who are in charge, do we really care? Do we find ways to make sure? And I'm trying to be as objective as possible. But it's almost a year. So Leroy continues to become a social comment, even at the end of the story.
That's interesting to me. One of the things I always think about when it comes to writing, especially Caribbean writing, is advocacy and advocating for the most marginalized, which is what you've done very, very well here. Do you think that that's a central responsibility of a Caribbean writer, especially given the circumstances that we have to battle on the environmental front and other fronts of vulnerability?
It's unfortunate in some ways that we have to advocate all the time. It's unfortunate, but that's our reality. The right of a kite runner. He said that the third world, very Western term, the third world writer is always asked to carry the flag on his back, to walk with his flag, this heavy flag, almost like a crucifix. I don't think it is because of gatekeepers, because I don't listen to gatekeepers. I've always said to gatekeepers, shut up, Leroy, because I think that you have to allow people to make their own statements about their own reality. But I do believe that it is necessary to, whether you like it or not, somewhere in your writing, all of the flaws, all of the inefficiencies, all of the deficiencies, all of the weak parts are going to come out in your writing as a Caribbean writer. And the reality is that we live in a vulnerable place. We're talking about rising seas and all that. And you don't want to depress people, but you want to say, listen, this is my reality. This is where I am at. This is my contemporary reality. Am I going to ignore it and just write other stuff? I can write a good romance, I know it. I love people discovering love and falling in love and all of the nuances that come with that thing and this new relationship energy and all that. And that is included sometimes, but I always bring it back to what's the superstructure? What else is happening in the world when you two are doing this? Is it love in a time of cholera, things like that.
I was really struck by Pre's decision to put together this collection in the wake of the hurricane, because I think in the aftermath of disaster, we're used to focusing on very material needs. So shelter, food, etc. But this made me stop and think about what are our other needs in a time of vulnerability. So for you as a creative, as a writer, what would you say is the significance of storytelling in the aftermath of disaster?
It's really important, first of all, to remind people that we've done this and we've gotten through this and we can do it again, regardless of the differences in the aftermath, because we had groundwater coming up and people have never seen that, This was a hurricane that was nothing like Gilbert. And I remember Gilbert. I mean, I was a kid, but I remember Gilbert. And it's important to not only remind people that we'll get through this, but to also say to the future, you have what it takes to do advocacy and to be very conscious of what it is that you're up against or what you face. And also that you not only face an enemy, which is natural disasters, you're also going to face a particular kind of neo-imperialism that asks you to make for them a gift of land and water. We have to start thinking about that stuff. I say these things cryptically, but there is also going to be the next level of a challenge, which starts to ask Caribbean states to offer things in order to be protected. And I mean that with whether being a part of the new frontier that we face, whether being a part of the issues that we face. Does aid come as it always does, or is aid going to now come with a particular kind of price? And we hear the smatterings of it, and we know that this is happening, and we hear people talking about this, and I want to be as politically correct as possible. We hear people talking about this. We hear people talking, make me a deal. Make me a deal. What are the deals that we're going to be asked to make? Are we not yet making enough deals? There are inaccessible beaches in Jamaica. It's almost like a surf war. Okay. What are the other things that we're going to be asked to make a deal? So there's a lot going on in those 800 words.
No, there's so much. And in talking to you, I'm seeing how much I didn't see initially when I read the story. And I think you're right when you're saying that, fiction is really that vehicle to talk about all of these different issues. One of the things you made me think about is you said about making a deal, and it makes me wonder how much can you really make a deal when you're in this position where you don't have much bargaining power? Where, example, in the aftermath of a hurricane, you're struggling. There's so much that you need to think about, so many needs in those moments. And what you're describing, it does sound scary, but I see what you're saying about we're not removed from that reality right now.
Yes, yes. In the initial discussions as well, we did speak about tourism, and ISIS did bring it up. I mean, this idea of what happens in an all inclusive resort. That the other side of the coin is an all inclusive resort, and everybody's taken care of, regardless of the complaints we heard coming out of the tourist sector after Melissa. So we have all that happening, but at the same time, wow, what if you took all these homeless people and put them in an all inclusive? She said that in a very tongue in cheek way, and I said, well, let's find a way to put that in there, and I did. And so it's interesting because we live in such an alternative reality in a land that is just 54 miles across and 145 miles long. It's an amazing place where all these things are happening, and it's two different worlds altogether.
Were there any challenges that you had to navigate as a writer, not just technically and structurally, but on a personal level in telling a story like this? Were there difficulties?
Yeah, well, I wanted more words. I wanted a great word count, But once I got to 800 and something words, I said, I'm not going to get to the 1,000. I'm definitely not going to get to the 1,000. I'm not going to introduce a new idea or a new concept. I only wanted to talk about what his past might have been and to establish that indeed he has mental challenges, because he blamed it on his alter ego. He said, look, you told me to burn down the house. I have nowhere to live now. So my technical challenge was making sure that I ended it where I was supposed to end. And I think the ending, usually I know my ending of a story before or in the middle of when I've started, when I'm in the middle of it, as things come together, I know where I want to end up because it's smart and it's easier. I do write by the seat of my pants though, but I kind of try to know where it's going to end. And then I try to make sure that every single beginning of every single part hits you hard, wow, why did you say it like that? And thank you for confirming that Shut Up Leroy is strong. I wasn't sure. So I always keep, when I'm writing a story, I go to all the classics and all the people and Margaret Atwood and people like that and Olive Scene, and I go into their first lines. What are their first lines? I obsess over first lines. What are the first lines? How does it do this? Because I need to drag you along like a person who has ADHD. I need to understand that I have readers who are now so visual that they're into video. I need to drag you along. And so that's my challenge first. What's my first line going to be? And then after that, the word count. Do I have enough to say? And again, if I have to become creative because I don't have a lot of words to play with, then yeah, I'm going to do something. I'm going to have a twist at the end. I know that the ending is a little bit more of a nuance with what happened in Jamaica, and therefore Jamaicans might understand it more. But I think that's fine because I wanted to make sure that you go back to the story and look at it again and say, really? Where did he go? And what happened there? Was that a safe area? I love these maps that have, if a nuclear holocaust happened tomorrow, these are the 10 safest places in the world. Okay. All right. I hear you. Yeah, what happened? What happened to Leroy?
Also obsessive beginnings, especially because for me, I think it says to the reader, this is who's telling this story. This is whose
Yes,
perspective we're following. And
that's
it's
right.
always important which perspective you start with and bring them along.
Yeah.
My final few questions, we're wrapping up now. I wanted
Well,
to move a little bit away from the story and a little bit towards you as the writer, the individual. One
mhm,
of the things I'm curious about listening to you talk about your other stories as well is what do you think you're seeking to say to the world as a writer across your
mhm.
different bodies of work?
If I was asked to do this, if I had been given some kind of mantle when I was born, this is what you get. These are the talents you get, and you're going to have to do so and so with it. Um, the prizes that you get, right? And any monetary, anything you access in terms of money, all of that is secondary to saying there was once a person who said, you need to be aware, absolutely aware. There are many times personally in our lives where it's like, I need to fix this problem. No, you don't need to fix the problem. You just need to be aware of it. What are your triggers? Now, we have so many triggers as Caribbean nations. We're triggered colonialism, triggered slavery, triggered capitalism versus communism in the 1970s, Jamaica, especially with all the kinds of activities that we had there. We have all these triggers. And as an individual who is growing up in this environment, you are sometimes absolutely unaware of your triggers. And so you really have not yet discovered you within the context of the land that you live in. And so you wake up every day and you're told that when you're in the cinema, you stand and you sing the national anthem and you do so and so. And these are the symbols that we go by and all of that. And all those things are wonderful, especially when Usain Bolt is running and you say, yeah, I'm cheering for Jamaica. Are you aware of all the other things? You don't necessarily have to do anything, but are you aware of all the other things that makes you a part of this land called Jamaica, Vincent and Lucia, Trinidad, Barbados, all of that? Are you aware? And the reason for awareness is this: the opportunities are present, but we have to work for them like cracking a coconut, and the threats are still existing.
This is making me think of, I read Camilla's book recently, The Last Wonder Woman. And one of the things that stood out to me was the ending where the character talks about books and writers issuing warnings. And I think when I read it, I was like, wow, this made a lot of things click for me. It's something that you feel as a writer, but seeing it expressed in that way, I was like, this is what we're doing as writers.
Yes, yes. And I'll tell you, I've read excerpts from Last One Room. I know Kai. We've been on school tours together. I've known him for a long time, but just like Marlon. But I've not read The Last One Woman, but I read excerpts of it. And I'm happy you told me this just now, because that's the truth. And I think that's Kai's mind as well. That's what we're doing. That's what we're doing. And we're not doing it. And you can't do it in a kind of self-righteous way where you think somehow you're clairvoyant and you're a prophet and you know more than so and so. It's just, there's so many things that happen on a daily. You start asking yourself, well, why is that? There are too many things that exist in the air for us to say, well, I can't find anything to write about. So somewhere along the line, that stuff, if you're, again, aware, will come out in your writing, all of it. And it happens in the headline. The book I'm writing now, I could say all of these 21 stories are influenced by headlines. Jamaica is not a real place. When people say that, it's not offensive. It's not a real place. Like, there's another thing that says Jamaica always a keep. Something's always happening in Jamaica. Fascinating thing. So yeah, that would be my thing, to make people aware, just to nudge you a little bit, and say, were you aware? And they said, what? Are you serious? That the Nazis wanted to get into the Northern Caribbean during 1944. Oh yeah, you didn't know that? You didn't know they bombed Venezuelan boats, the same oil that other people are. You didn't know this, What? I want to stir conversation. I want to inspire. I want people to say, I'm going to do this because now I'm aware of where I am.
I think one of the things about that is when you take notice, you realize that the past, the present, the future, all of it's interconnected.
Absolutely. It's all happening. It's all happening. It's going down now. It's going down now.
I wonder about responsibility a lot, because I think about that when I'm telling stories. How do you determine to yourself, you know what, maybe this is not my story to tell, or maybe this is not my voice to embody?
Yeah. And I've thought about that. My first novel was I'm going to call it personally political. It happened in the Reaganite 80s. And there are many times where I used to tell myself that what is political is not my story to tell. And that's simply because I wasn't aware at the time. That was 13 years ago. I wasn't aware. As I've become more aware and more involved, and as I found my voice where I stand on particular issues, I think it is most important to offer a perspective and to do the research that allows you to understand the perspective, to understand what other perspectives are, and to figure out where you are in the middle of things. I think it's most important to say to yourself, I guess the other part of it would be to ask yourself, do I have the emotional fuel to bring this story to 280 words, to bring this story to 5,000 words? So one part is being aware and learning and researching. The other part is saying, am I feeling it? If I'm not feeling it, I'm not doing it. I can write about cults until the cows come home, because I think I grew up in one, I can write about that for over and over and over. That's another interview, Amani. So, but I can write about it forever. But you have to ask yourself as a writer, do I have the emotional fuel to finish this 280 words or 280 pages or 5,000 words? And if you can talk about this with your friends all night until they tell you to shut up, Leroy, then it means that you have the energy to do it. And you should go ahead and write that book or that story. If you're trying to do it just because you want to sound like Toni Morrison, then don't do it. don't do it, absolutely don't do it.
Now I'm realizing I need to put your first book on my reading list. I haven't read it, and I know I need to.
Absolutely. I think you have a lot of fun with that guy. He's me saying all the things I should have said when I was 9 years old.
Okay. And you need
Yeah.
to read The Last Wonder Woman. Absolutely, you need to read it.
Absolutely. I think now, yes. Somebody did compare my last novel that's now being edited with The Last Wonder Woman. I said, well, that's interesting. And so now this is my second sign that I should read it. Yeah, don't tell Kai.
I won't, don't worry. My final question in wrapping up is, what advice do you have for Caribbean writers who are still trying to find their voice in this whole thing?
Yeah, well, it's always a trick question, but I'm always daring enough to answer it. First thing I'm going to say is like, just take notes. Same awareness concept, take notes. I have this theory that it's not about finding the inspiration to write. It's about that you really haven't collected enough. You really haven't collected enough to fuel what you want to write about. So if you don't walk around, and I don't mean your phone, if you don't walk around with a notebook writing down notes every day, you have nothing to write. At 3:00 in the morning, you will sit down looking at a blank screen and you've processed nothing during the day. But if you did walk around and you realize that, here where you're standing was a swamp 500 years ago, and there were people living here who no longer exist. You're like, oh, wow, I wonder what the corner of Harbor Street and Beeston Street used to be 500 years ago. You just had an idea. You can go forward and backwards in time if you want to, from this same spot on the corner, where there's a guy selling, snow cones or sky juice or whatever. So all that speculative fiction, science fiction, all of that, it's all in there. It's all where you live. I'm thinking that we haven't experimented enough with this thing. So if you walk around, interview the world every day, write your notes down, think about things in a particular way, catch a piece of a conversation, a soundbite from there, and you put all of that in a literal notebook that you're going to skip through and say, here's an idea. And I think you begin there. Those people who say, I need a mentor is fine. And I've had very good mentors. But I think a lot of people who say I need a mentor mean I need to begin. I just need to write my notes down. Right? Some mentors you never meet. You just read the stuff and you go, I can do that. That sounds like me. That story sounds like me. You know what? Let me read more about what this person's done. And you write your own notes and you go, you know what? This is the direction I'm going to take. And your voice happens. Your voice happens over time. Your voice happens. And I think it's a beautiful thing to experience yourself growing with writing, to experience that happening. And that's amazing, especially in an age where we're most preoccupied with what I call spoof culture. Everything on social media, half of what's on social media is spoofing something else on social media. So everything is now becoming a shadow of a shadow of a shadow. And we're spoofing this until we're tired of it. We need to, the only way you're going to survive, especially not being influenced by stuff like that and being able to enjoy it, but not be influenced by it. The only way is by original thought. How do you create close to original thought? I don't think people need a mentor necessarily. You need to begin.
I think you've said a lot throughout, but I just wanted to give you the opportunity if there's any closing words that you want to share.
Well, first of all, I go on a rant every single time because I think every interview or every conversation is an opportunity to say something that we might have not considered or something that might inspire something else. And so the only thing I would say is to become, for anybody, become interested in reading and in writing your own thoughts. And you don't have to write a novel. And you can, you write what you want. You don't force yourself to become anybody else or force yourself to sound like anybody else because that's the easiest way to lose your own voice. You read Sula and you really like when Toni Morrison spoke about saffron, being the dust being saffron. You're like, I wish I could do that. You can do that, man. You can do it in different ways. You have a different reality. Just go ahead and do that. So find your own voice, protect your own voice, protect your work, protect your people, and be aware.